Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and even good night to some of us. My name is Elizabeth Belper. I am a member of the board and executive committee of ISOCARP and also the board focal point for women in planning. And I'm co-leading this session with Juaniki Leers. She is also board member of ISOCARP and chair of Women in Planning Network of Commonwealth Association of Planners and head of School of the Built Environment at the University of Technology in Sydney. So a very warm welcome to all of you and thank you for joining. First, a couple of basic house rules. Please keep your microphones muted for the first part, and the second part we will have a discussion and you're very welcome to speak and then unmute yourselves. Meanwhile, we encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat, even during the event. And after the panel speakers, we will have a group picture as well. So in this Cyber Agora, we will hear from women in planning, how they respond and take action to lead climate action that is so desperately needed around the globe. So there is both an urgency and an opportunity. And maybe you read the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was issued just a month ago. And it reminds us of that urgency. In fact, the messages are very sobering. And it tells us that some impacts are already irreversible and that there is a narrowing window for action. So the coming decade is very important for us. We're also reminded that everyone and all places are affected by climate impact, but not equal and not even. So people and ecosystems least able to cope are hardest hit. Cities are hotspots of climate impact and risk. Women and girls are disproportionately affected, and gender inequalities are further exacerbated by climate-related hazards. And to illustrate this, a few statistics. 80% of people displaced by climate-related disasters are women and girls. World Economic Forum estimates that if we continue with action on gender at the same pace, that it will take us 136 years to close the gender gap. We know that more than half of the countries in the world never had a female leader. This is also influencing action. And on top of this, 2/3 of climate-related development assistance does not consider gender equality in the design or implementation or in the budget. And only 0.2% reaches specific women organizations or women-led projects. So there is a lot to do. If we look at climate negotiations, only 1/3 of leadership positions in the climate change are held by women. So that's an improvement. And also the gender balance of government delegations has improved. But then if they look at who speaks in all those sessions, that is actually 74% of the time in plenary meetings is by men. And if we look at our profession, it is very hard to find exact data on urban planners because it's often taken, the positions are often taken by architects, engineers. Some countries don't even offer the education. If we look at Zimbabwe, for instance, these are numbers from last year, only 10 female registered architects. And the first female president was in 2012 for an organization existing since 1927. And because many of the functions are also taken by engineers, the numbers are even lower. But there is also opportunity. There is opportunity for action and accelerating change for a just, an equitable and sustainable tomorrow. First, we have the cities. So they have major impact and risks, but they offer also opportunities for us, and planning can deliver and can help deliver radical and systematic change. Planning is a vital tool both for mitigation, adaptation, and building resilience. And we also should not forget that 70% of the built environment yet has to be built, and a lot of it in fast urbanizing regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. The second thing is that women are, as we see around the world, they're active and effective agents. We also have a strong group of female mayors, but the number is still very restricted, and we don't have enough women leaders at the intersection of planning and climate change, still very underrepresented in leadership in planning and the built environment. So we want to support this and amplify the messages and the roles of women pushing for change. The good news is that just a couple of days ago, there was the UN Committee on the Status of Women. It's one of the biggest events actually at the UN. And there was conclusions adopted by the member states to reaffirm that women and girls leadership is key to address climate change and disaster risk reduction for all. So we have to move from these intentions to action, and we will hear some of it in this panel. And thirdly, as International Society for Urban and Regional Planners, we also take the opportunity to put a spotlight on some of the topics and challenges of from geographies and countries that we unfortunately don't hear enough from. So we want to listen to their challenges, hear perspectives and also opportunities, actions for the way forward. So I'm very delighted and I welcome our wonderful panel of speakers and commentators. Our speakers of today, they are pushing the boundaries with underground urbanism for climate resilience, inspiring with Mumbai Climate Action Plan, an Indian first and important for our world as well, or putting spotlight on women and girls on the front line of climate crisis in sub-Saharan Africa, and also challenging status quo of women leadership in planning and climate action in Japan. So the first speaker, very welcome, Antonia Cornaro. She is co-chair of ITACUS, International Tunnel and Underground Space Association, and lecturer at the renowned Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in ETH in Zurich. She has very extensive experience in urban and transport planning, New York, London, Vienna, Zurich, and she works as expert underground space for Amberg Engineering. And her goal is to increase mobility, livability, and resilience of urban areas. She wrote a book recently published and also received the Isaac Albers Award for this. Please, Antonia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for this really kind introduction and also revealing introduction on the status quo, on the state of affairs, on female participation in planning and especially in tackling climate change. In terms of the NGO work I do with the ITA Committee of Underground Space, we're really a committee that pushes for the sustainable use of the urban environment, and especially focusing on the underground space, which I will tell something in a minute. But I also want to point out that when I started with the committee, I was, I think, the only woman in our committee, starting as Secretary General, and then was promoted to Vice President at some stage, and then even to co-chair of the committee. And this has been really sort of a change that we can see in our organization overall in the ITA, which is because it's the field of tunneling and then civil engineering has been traditionally male dominated, but more and more we see more women being extremely active in this field. I can also see that in the engineering consulting firm Amberg Engineering, where I work for, where when I started I was 1 out of 5 women, and now I'm sure we have at least a third of the staff, if not almost half, are now women. So that's very positive, and that's also what we're aiming to do with our committee. We have 3 activity groups, and 3 of which are led by women. One of which is Mahak Agrawal, which some of you probably know. She's from India, a very active ISOCARP member, and she leads our activity group on urban adaptability and really doing research on how can our cities become more resilient through the use of underground space. So climate change is one of the biggest issues facing us, and especially our cities. Most mega cities are coastal cities and therefore flood prone. They're susceptible to erratic weather patterns, to heat, droughts, to flooding, to storms. And what is the role of underground space in all this? Well, underground space can provide sheltered areas, can actually help leave transport and emergency relief infrastructure unencumbered during such disasters. And we have many examples where this has been the case in, for instance, cities that regularly get flooded, like Kuala Lumpur or Bangkok or Tokyo, where the underground infrastructure, because it's a modern designed and designed in a way that it can actually hold extra capacity, for instance, in terms of increased precipitation. It can take in this extra, these flash floods and store them either, or channel them past the existing system. Paris is a city that has an old underground infrastructure and sewage tunnels, and they cannot longer hold the capacity. So Paris was flooded, I think it was last summer. So the city is very busy, for instance, expanding the capacity in terms of the underground to hold the excess water in such instances. And not only Paris, tons of cities like Dubai and Singapore are involved in major efforts to increase their infrastructure in that sense. But what is the role of the subsurface in the climate change adaptation? Well, as I said, it has a vital role in capturing rainwater, but it forms the base layer for green spaces in our cities. It provides cooling, and it has a massive role in the energy transition from fossil fuel-based energy to renewables. And that is by applying geothermal energy applications and also aquifer thermal energy storage systems. So I'm sure you've heard of geothermal energy applications where we can derive energy from the earth in depths of various 100 meters. The temperatures are much hotter, and we can basically extract warm water out of the earth. And thermal energy storage systems are systems where we can also use the subsurface to hold water and energy for future applications and can retrieve them when needed. So we can really help mitigate shocks and stresses by applying the underground space. It also can help us in terms of earthquakes, in terms of heat island effects. So the last thing we actually need and want is paving over all our cities, because we're thereby reducing the capacity of the soil to absorb water and to also make it cooler for when we have droughts or extreme hot weather patterns. There are a lot of very great examples where we can combine underground infrastructure like road tunnels or metro tunnels or parking garages with also being able to deal with stormwater management. And I have examples from the Netherlands, from Kuala Lumpur, from San Francisco, to name a few, which I can't show you in these few minutes, but I can provide links afterwards. So our committee's proverb is really the next level up is down. The subsurface consists of water, of materials, of geothermal energy, and of space. And we need to use that wisely. There's a mayor who said by applying the subsurface as a new spatial dimension in their planning efforts, the mayor of Zwolle said that, he was able to reduce the city's soil decontamination by 75%. He was able to generate new resources. He was able to have a sustainable water table management. It helped flood prevention. And not only that, as so important for so many cities, clean groundwater. For instance, in Switzerland, where I live, 80% of the drinking water comes from groundwater sources. So we need to preserve these groundwater and drinking water reserves for future generations. And the mayor of Zwolle said, it's an attractive supply of energy cooling and water for industries. And with that, I just also want to point out that not only do we store important resources in the underground, but we also can grow food there. And there have been examples now at the actual stage in London, Paris, and Seoul, where food is grown underground in terms of vertical farming, but really going below the surface, which is extremely space and energy efficient. We have zero land use, we have zero waste, and we have much less water needed than on the surface. And all that, in closing my short presentation, is to say that there's a lot of potential in the underground space, and we need to really consider it in our cities planning efforts to make our cities more resilient for the future and more adapted to the issues of climate change and climate adaptation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antonia, for revealing some of the invisible layers, both for adaptation, and you pointed also, I think, an important thing is the emergency, which it is already taking place in many parts of the world, and but also the opportunity for more sustainable use of resources and space and land for the future. So we go to the next speaker. Very pleased to welcome Lubaina Rangwala. She is the program head of Urban Development and Resilience, WRI, or the World Resource Institute, India, Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, where she focuses on nature-based solutions, green infrastructure to address long-term climate risks in Indian cities. And she works with vulnerable communities to build their resilience capacity. And she has also led the development of a global tool on this. As a regional planner and architect, she worked in US and India, also worked with research and as a visiting lecturer. And the exciting news is that this month, a couple of weeks ago, the Mumbai Climate Action Plan was launched, which is the first for India of this type, and I'm sure also has messages for the world. And Lubaina was part of this, so a real pleasure to have you here, Lubaina.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon from Mumbai. Really happy to be here with so many like-minded women planners and be part of this conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Mumbai Climate Action Plan and the role of women leadership in the process, but also sort of understanding the ways in which a lot of the issues that are represented differently, across genders and income groups, how did we sort of integrate some of that in the process? So the Mumbai Climate Action Plan is not India's first climate action plan. There are many others, but it is the first climate action plan that aims to achieve a net zero target by 2050. That makes it very different from, and it helps set up short-term, medium-term, and long-term targets for the city. So we have, a 30% reduction goal for until 2030, a 45% reduction goal until 2040, and then a net zero target for 2050. Of course, given the kind of development challenges the city is facing, with all the ambitious targets that we've been able to integrate into the plan, we still have a 30% residual emissions gap. And that essentially speaks to the transitions and policy kind of input that is required to, transition in the, user practices like dependency on cooking fuel in households. That very recently, in the last maybe 10 years, India has worked very hard across the country to transition people towards using LPG and PNG. And what we realize is that this will be sort of the heavy lift is to now say, now move to electric cooking, wherein we're still sort of working in many geographies to really still enable the use of LPG and PNG in some households. Even in Mumbai, with all the policy and programmatic work through public distribution systems, people are still using polluting fuels to cook, whether it's wood fire or kerosene and others. So these are some of the sort of development gaps that we identified. And what is then special about the plan is that we've been able to then integrate some of these into a much more practical roadmap for the city, that acknowledges that some of these challenges, because we know it today, we will be able to maybe work alongside the roadmap on some of these from a policy point of view, maybe a technology or innovation point of view, over the next decades to come. The plan essentially focuses on 6 priority sectors. So there is the energy and buildings sector, sustainable mobility, sustainable waste management. These 3 sectors are more mitigation heavy. And then on the adaptation heavy sectors, we are looking at urban greening and biodiversity, air quality, and urban flooding and water resource management. This is to say that even though there is a much more sort of mitigation focus in the first 3 and the adaptation focus in the adaptation side, when we talk about urban greening and biodiversity, while we're looking at it from a risk mitigation point of view, we're also being able to kind of address the city's desire and aim to plant more trees and really sort of work on its sequestration potential as well, but helping them strategize that if we want to kind of increase carbon sinks in the city, how can we do it in high risk areas so that we can kind of address both needs instead of ad hocly planting wherever there is the space. So the plan definitely takes a lot more of a detailed kind of it takes a very detailed sort of view into some of these challenges, and tries to also sort of even institutionally address some of the needs for different departments to come together and start looking at issues much more coordinatedly. For example, on flood management and greening, because there are 2 different departments taking care of solid stormwater drainage, and greening is being taken up by the gardens department. We're also proposing then, how a much more coordinated landscapes approach can be adopted, wherein we can look at flood mitigation through nature-based solutions, and therefore bringing the green and the blue very much together as a common sort of vision and aesthetic that the department takes up. So these are some of the ways in which we've been able to look at the priority sectors. The plan aims at 24, so six sectors and 24 actions overall. And the ways in which we've been able to then bring in, in terms of women leadership, I led the plan, and my colleague Shruti Narayan from C40 Cities is the regional director for South and West Asia. And we're backed with an excellent team of planners, environmental scientists, sustainability management professionals, with a very good gender balance, of course, more women than men on the team, ironically, because the sector is like that. But from the city side, it was mostly male leadership. But because of the ways in which we all sort of work together, it never felt like we were not part of the process. There was not a single meeting that was held around the Mumbai Climate Action Plan where we couldn't make it. If we couldn't make it, if I was not available, the meeting was rescheduled. So we were very much part of the sort of decision making and planning process throughout. And in terms of, and because this was such a heavy lift, right? Mumbai, a city of 12 million people plus, it wasn't very easy to integrate people's perspectives and diverse points of views in the ways in which we drafted some of our initial thought process and approaches. So what we did very earlier on is, just after we finished the inventory process, we held a series of sectoral consultations, and very consciously through those consultations, like if we were talking about waste management, we had someone who represented women waste workers in slum communities who spoke about the importance of formalization of informal workers and social safety nets that are very much part of and may not be directly, you know, a mitigation target, but very much a part of the need for the city to be more inclusive in its climate action plan. Similarly, you know, when we talked about urban flooding or water resource management, sanitation was not directly a kind of an issue that could be woven into it, but we very consciously brought in professionals, academic institutions, researchers who have been working in the WASH sector and talking about the issue of access to sanitation, which is a basic developmental challenge that is, you know, that plagues people's everyday life in informal settlements. And how do we then integrate some of those issues as we think about, you know, long-term challenges in the city. Finally, you know, I just want to close on the fact that what we also managed to do in this whole process is to create a very detailed vulnerability assessment for the city, which really helped us draft much more robust and detailed adaptation actions that spoke to various income groups and housing conditions in the city. And you know, these are resources available on the Mumbai Climate Action Plan website. It's mcap.mcgm.gov.in, where you'll be able to see the vulnerability assessment, which, you know, integrates both socioeconomic needs in the city, access to services, and brings in sort of a risk and climate risk analysis. So I'll close on that. Thank you so much for this time.
Thank you so much, Lubaina. It's very inspiring. I think it's a first, so it's going to be a lot of people will be looking at what's happening. But I think we got a lot of elements from the content and how you can integrate or link with vulnerable communities, and then also link with daily practices. And that's an aspect which doesn't automatically come up in these big climate intentions, the daily practices and also the institutional arrangements. Thank you so much. We move to the next speaker, and a special thanks to Professor Olusola Olufemi, because she's speaking to us from Canada, so it's in the middle of the night. But she has extensive experience as a researcher and in planning education in Nigeria, South Africa, and Canada. She received the Gert Albers Award and other awards for her work, and has also been coordinating Women in Planning Network 15 to 20 years ago, I think. She works with people residing in slums and marginalized communities. You will find much more details and bios of the speakers on the website. So I invite you, Olusola. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Can somebody share my slides? Can you hear me?
Marite, can you share the slides?
Yes, 1 second.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to the previous speakers. I'm going to touch on livability and health of women and girls in the front lines of climate crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. My work has been in Africa and with marginalized communities, focusing on women and children specifically. But within this context, I'm going to talk about livability. I'm going to mention something about health. And in the area of planning leadership, I'll talk about the ethic of care as it links to climate crisis. We are all aware that the fragility of our ecosystems is exposed whenever there's flooding or wildfire, drought, deforestation, sea level rise or degradation or drought. And climate change is about lives and livelihoods of people. The climate crisis is an existential threat and could displace 1.2 billion people by 2050, according to statistics. However, women are at the front lines of climate crisis. They are the receiving end, and they are also part of the solution to climate crisis. Stemming from the basic idea of planning, which seeks harmony between land uses and seeks public interest for the common good. I believe the environment is a public good, is a common good, and that's why the ethics of care and sustainable care of the environment should be at the front and center of climate action and solution by planners, and gender should be put at the center of this. So giving a geographical context to the first slide, please. Can you go back? Can you say, okay, thank you. Yes, giving a geographical context to my presentation. It's Sub-Saharan Africa, and you can see that that's the countries just below the Sahara Desert. This part of the continent houses almost 1.2 billion people, which makes up of 50.1% of women. The region is diverse in culture, diverse in environment as well, diverse in peoples. And we see that women make up the bulk of this population, and women also make up the bulk of the extremely poor people in this continent. In Sub-Sahara, you have about 244 million women and girls that are living in extreme poverty in the region. And the reason being, there's patriarchy. This is something that's been embedded in the culture. And this is why gender equality is so important to fight patriarchy. Women in this part of this environment too, they live in settlements that have poor or inadequate infrastructures, and they also don't have access to education. So most of them are illiterate. Next slide, please. So when I come from the livability context, I'm looking at the quality of life, the quality of living, the comfort of people in the marginalized communities. And that's why my focus has been on women living in precarious locations who face ecological threats every day of their lives. These are women in conflict situations, women that are displaced due to climate crisis, environmental refugees or homeless women and girls, women living in rural areas, women living in hard-to-reach areas, and women living in slums, informal settlements, and on the streets. So the livability context of these women is actually poor. So when now, you just imagine women and girls that are living in cardboard boxes during a flooding event, or women and girls that are living in corrugated iron sheets during heat waves of over 40 degrees centigrade. Just picture the context of those women. These are the women that I have been working with for quite a number of years. And unfortunately, the lived reality of these women and girls are often ignored or omitted in our plans and policies. They are always left behind in our plans and policies as planners. Next slide, please. Yeah. So from the coastal slums of Cape Town to Kibera, Nairobi, or the Havana slums of settlements, informal settlements in Namibia, we look at these women and the situation in which they live. They use cooking stoves, kerosene stoves, or sometimes firewood. They live in slums, in lagoons, in swamp conditions, and this exposes them to the vagaries of weather, the vagaries of climate change. So they are exposed to vector-borne diseases most of the time. Water and foodborne illnesses is very rife in these communities because they live in poorly ventilated housing situations. They face occupational and environmental health conditions. And this is manifested in the quantity of greenhouse gas emissions in their environment, the particulate matters in the air, and the hydrofluorocarbons and short-lived climate pollutants that hang over most of these communities. I take the example of women living on garbage dumps in Lagos, for example. these women, this is a community of about more than 50,000 people living on garbage dumps. They burn their refuse there. There's no access to water. There's no access to electricity. And so when there's flooding, the whole place is just something else. You can just picture that. So these women live in the worst situation. They don't have access to toilets as well. Sanitation facilities are absent. So most of the things they do within their community, it's not eco-friendly, if I can put it that way. But because of time, we cannot go in depth. I have only 5 to 7 minutes. So from this, the next slide, please. I think where we can look, we can situate the context of these women within the feminist ethics of care. If we look at the injustices based on gender, race, and class that are related to exploitation and degradation of the environment, we see that ecofeminist or ecofeminism share an environmental ethic of care based on women's biology, their labor, and their social position and location. So when I look at this, it's my opinion or my view that ethics of care behoves on everyone, whether we are planners, whether we are women or girls living in some of this context or other contexts, to safeguard our common good, which is the environment, in a moral and just way. So sustainable care of the environment can be achieved through gender equality, because climate crisis is a moral and rights-based issue. So I believe women planners can be leaders and champions in the areas of training, educating, and just providing information for women in this context, because when we go to these communities and you mention some climate change, for example, the word climate change, they don't have an understanding. They are not informed. They are not aware. They just know that, oh, there's flooding and displaces them. There's heat wave and they cannot stay in their corrugated iron sheets home, or they cannot live on the streets. They have to seek for shelter. So I believe that these women, they are at the center of solving their ecological problems, because right now, these women are organizing. They are organizing to save money. They are organizing through cooperatives and collaboration amongst themselves to try and, keep their environment clean, to salvage the little property that they have from climate emergency. Thank you. So the next slide is planners taking leadership. I think to minimize these injustices of environmental degradation and exploitation, planners must take the lead in providing platforms where women and girls could exercise their voice and agency in decision-making. Also to protect the livelihoods of these women who are basically in the informal sector of the economy. They live in informal settlements, they work in the informal sector to provide livelihoods for themselves and their families. So we have to build and strengthen the resilience of these women and girls in the context of climate change and environmental degradation and disasters by providing sustainable infrastructure and public access to public services. We also need to amplify the voices and visibility of these women based on their experience and knowledge through advocacy planning. And I think one thing planners should avoid is greenwashing or gender washing. We shouldn't just add gender to our policies, our programs and projects. We shouldn't just add green. It has to be practical, something that is practical and something that is beneficial to these women and girls in this context. And also we need to adopt the intersectoral lens, the whole systems approach, focusing on the range of different aspects of urban planning, climate action, air quality, livability, health, as it interacts with gender. And finally, just my final comment, the last slide, is that the need to recognize and adopt connectional intelligence. That is, we need to curate and mobilize women and girls in these communities or in this context. And connectional intelligence is the ability to make breakthroughs by combining ideas, people, information, and resources, and harnessing this together and putting it into actions, mitigation, and adaptation of climate change. Also, we need to invest in women and girls. Investing does not only mean investing money. We can invest our time in these communities as well, and invest in infrastructures in these communities. So thank you so much. That's my perspective. Unfortunately, we cannot talk more about this. Takes hours and hours to expand what is happening in these communities. But I thank you for the opportunity to be able to just give a spotlight on the context of these women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olusola. We will keep that in mind to maybe with the next World Planning Congress to ensure a bigger slot for specific topics under this. But thank you for bringing the attention to a whole set of different issues. And I think the reality where we don't hear enough from the slums, which also are about to increase the population in slums over the coming years, and their daily lives, which is far away from the big climate concepts, but they experience it every day. And the new ideas around it, like environmental refugees and gender washing. So thank you for that. We go to our last speaker, and this is very happy to have Urara Takaseki among us. She is a PhD candidate and researches sustainable and inclusive urban planning at University of Tokyo, Department of Urban Engineering. She is the co-founder of a number of organizations, one of them providing SDG project-based education programs to students in Japan. And Urara is also a 3-time One Young World Ambassador who is challenging the status quo in several areas in need of leadership. Please, Urara.
Thank you. Sorry, I was listening. I was so into the conversation of everybody else that I forgot I was also going to speak today. Thank you, everybody, for your for each of your presentations. It was really interesting, and thank you for the the introduction. So my background is mainly in urban planning, but also just sustainable climate action in general. So in my introduction, she mentioned that I was a 3-time One Young World Ambassador. I've been involved in climate action, sustainability activities with One Young World, the sort of what's called Young Davos, since high school. So I actually entered urban planning, the urban planning field from that perspective. And so really sustainability and empowering women is incredibly important to me. But at the same time, I've struggled with doing that as well. So I would love everybody's opinions and advice actually after this. So actually my background, academic background is mainly in local government and national security specifically. And my outside of academia activities have been focused on things like climate change and sustainability. And before I go into some of these activities that I've been doing in and outside of research, I'd like to introduce some of the things that are key trends in Japan regarding sustainability and sustainable planning. From my view and from sort of general conversations, there's the idea that there's 3 types of major groups in quote unquote sustainability space in Japan. One is the environmental sustainable space that's mainly coming from the MDGs or the SDGs activities and policies. And these mainly focus on things like waste and carbon emission reduction or energy, and mainly driven by the private sector or big national level subsidies. And there are also some experimental projects being done, again, in the private sector involving better use of green space, spreading the idea of eco districts. And this is mainly more on the urban planning side. But the climate action related initiatives in the planning space has been focused on green space, eco districts, and so on, mainly because all of the other aspects of sustainability is really in the public sector done by companies and so on. The second major group of sustainability in our country is economic or general sustainability. And in our case, it comes primarily from policies related to aging, depopulation, centralization to the Tokyo metropolitan area, and so on. And it's not necessarily climate change, but it's more related to we're losing workers in our rural areas, not even rural areas, our non-Tokyo level major cities. And so this is a different aspect of sustainability, and it's a huge theme in our country as well. And the third kind of big group is the smart city oriented field, and it's primarily incentivized by national government subsidies. And this is especially driven by private sector actors in mobility fields, both of which tech and mobility fields, which are mostly dominated again by men. And where do I find myself sort of in the spaces? So not only am I the only female student and researcher in our PhD department this year, we actually lost our only female professor in our department to a different department. And I work in education fields outside of the university just because we don't have enough women applying to our universities and our climate change related organizations and so on. And I'd like to touch on that a little bit after this. But I would also like to introduce some of the topics related to why we lack women in certain fields to this extent. And you will find a common, I guess, common theme among these problems, but the national or the societal society as a whole, we've been trying to put women into certain fields and positions, but there haven't been enough efforts to really understand the diverse range of barriers and desires of actual women in our country. And I think this is the key factor that's stopping women from taking these positions, regardless of the different opportunities that people are trying to provide. So, for example, in STEM or national governments, we lack women in general throughout the country. But this is kind of coming from the fact that we lack women in higher education, national universities that are so-called, the core central high-level universities. And this is actually said to be related to the imbalance between high-level all-boys high schools and all-girls high schools. For example, our university, University of Tokyo, is the former national university. So it's like Singapore University for Japan, but it became University of Tokyo in post-war. But originally, we only had men enter our, only all boys school students enter our school. And when we look at the ratio of people who, come from boys and girls high schools versus all boys high schools versus all girls high school, it's a ratio of like, if there are about 30 high schools that actually put students into our university. It's a very small group. First of all, it's very centralized, kind of gate kept amongst very elite high schools. But amongst those, over maybe 60% are from all boys high schools. And when we look at the ratio of women in our school specifically, we have about 20% undergrad students who are women, and then 28% who are women in the graduate schools, and then about 7% amongst professors. And this 7% amongst professors is including non-STEM, is including part-time or people with terminations coming soon, etc. And this has actually fallen in the past 5 years or so. This was the peak in about 2018. And in 2018, they started doing all kinds of initiatives to improve the female to male ratio. So they started doing women-specific scholarships and providing more support to female professors and things like that. And we still had a decline, which is an issue that the university is facing at the moment. And if I'm being honest, there's no clear answer as to why it's declining. There's talks about the economy and things like that, but we honestly really don't know why it's decreasing. So point being, there are a lot of initiatives trying to support women in our fields, regardless of if it's climate action, academia, but especially in academia and especially in STEM or climate action, it's decreasing. We're really not understanding how this is, and so on. And outside of research, I've been working actually a lot with local governments from volunteering, and I also started a nonprofit to work with them as well. And I realized that I found myself really learning a lot from seeing the field in local communities outside of Tokyo. And I thought, maybe these opportunities, they were presented to me because I had relations with local governments through my research. But I thought, if younger people could see the activities or experience these things, they might take more interest in sustainable planning and so on. And so I started involving high school students and university students into our nonprofit and kind of providing access for them to work with local governments or take part in, local activities related to planning in any way. We've also had contests to see, what kind of ideas do you have for your city and so on. And we've had about over 100 schools have teams of students present themselves. This is including women and men, but we've had a lot of girls entering our programs. So this has been very hopeful for us. And it's also been a way for me to understand what these girls are thinking when they think about going into a high school or a college or a certain field. And in the end, it narrows down to, society expects me to do this kind of thing. If my parents told me that if I go to this school, I will not be able to get married. They say, I would prefer to go to a private school, not a national university, because apparently you seem less appealing as a woman if you go into these fields, which is totally not true if you really go into these areas. But this is what their parents are telling them. This is what their teachers are telling them. And so it's coming down to emotional, familial sort of aspects. And so what I'm trying to do is provide opportunities for them to have mentors outside of their school, outside of their region, so that they can have a broader perspective, see what they're really interested in. Are they really avoiding these universities because they don't want to study, or is it because they've been told that their whole lives? And so kind of conclusion, sorry for going over time a bit, but I'm sort of experimenting as a researcher and practitioner, trying to experiment in and outside of academia, because clearly just doing things within the university is not engaging women enough. And it could be doing even worse, seeing the numbers. So I'm trying to just kind of reach out to people directly, reach out to young women directly. But I'm really happy to have a community like this that I can reach out to, so that I can also learn as a young researcher and practitioner for the future. And I'm personally learning a lot today, and I hope my perspective brings something new to the table. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Urara, for again bringing a very different perspective and surprising facts, I would say, and trends, and the actions you take. And yeah, we're looking forward to see how we can evolve as a society. We will do the group picture now, and I hand over to Juanie.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We would love for everybody to turn on your camera if you feel comfortable with that. And if our secretariat can help us to just get the screen up with everybody's cameras on. I think at the moment, Elizabeth is spotlighted on my screen.
Okay, just give me 1 second.
Thank you.
Please get ready, everyone. I will count until 3. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, one more time. Oh, so nice.
The new normal for taking group photos.
Exactly. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Brilliant.
Thank you so much. Great. So we are now at the part where we can discuss all these interesting topics. And thank you to all our speakers. I think very insightful presentations. Just looking at the time, I think this topic can keep us busy for numerous hours to go. And I think everybody's very passionate about it. While we plan to wrap up in an hour, I think if everybody's okay, we can discuss this topic for another 10-15 minutes, just to get some involvement from our panelists and from everybody attending. I think the one thing that I saw on the chat group, Martina, you mentioned the importance of ethics of care. And maybe to all of our speakers, how do we embed this in planning? Where do we start? What is if we tonight have to say, what is the start point of embedding ethic of care in planning? What is the main thing that we should aim at? So open to anybody willing to put up their hand. Urara, maybe I should point to you again, because it's very much aligned with what you presented. So yeah, if you had to a magic formula to tell us, where do we start?
Yes, so I think there are two things I'd like to mention. I think both in the end goes back to education in academia, both in universities and in the planning field in general, and also much younger high school, middle school, elementary school. So first starting with kind of the older side, at least in our country, I think it depends on the university or it depends on the country, but in Japan especially, the planning field tends to be have more people from engineering backgrounds, from not even civil engineering, but engineering in general. I personally come from a law and political science background, but I am the only person that had that background in our, for example, master's department. And most of our professors come from the same engineering department, kind of get invited as they get older and so on. So I think, first of all, creating more diversity in our education or in our student base could be one start, I think, because I think once we start getting too focused on the tech or too focused on the infrastructure aspects, we start to lose the ethics aspect as well. But I'd like to hear everyone else's opinions on that. And the second part is just starting even younger, because I think once you start going into a field in academia from university and so on, you start to take on the values of your professors, your advisors. And so even before you go, hardcore into a field, I think if people could really learn about what do they care about, what kind of values do they want to apply into your practices, then they might be able to take those into the fields and, actually fight the status quo, I guess, in the future when they do actually go into these fields.
Thank you so much. Martina and Olusolo, I see your hands, but at this stage, I would just quickly like to give over to Dushko. So Dushko and Hope is giving us reflections on the presentations that we had today. So Dushko, just maybe, your take on it. What's the main messages that you heard from the presentations?
Yes, thank you, Ioanni. It's an honor to address this session and be the person who will try to find some common ground and some bottom lines. And I have to tell you honestly, it is very difficult. We have heard 4 quite different presentations, of course, from 4 different angles, the different parts of the world with different experiences. But what is common to them, I think, is they obviously that they made the point about the role of women in these situations. And I will venture to say straight away that obviously there are signs of situation improving and more women appearing in the profession and in the decision-making process altogether. And the issues of women like poverty, health, and stuff like that being taken more into consideration, but it's woefully not enough. That's the message I get from all 4. We're making progress, but it's slow.
Yes.
And climate change is not slow. It's not waiting. It's fast. It's accelerating. So there's a somewhat, I'm afraid, pessimistic message that I hear in all 4 presentations. But of course, that also means that we are seeing what the problem is, and then one leaves a conference like this, a session like this, with a sense of urgency and a better understanding of the task. We really have to push this matter of the role of women in planning, both in that active sense as being the planners, and in that sense of understanding the issues of women better. So that clearly has to be the message of this session. I will just try very briefly. I've got some notes, but just very briefly what I heard from all 4 speakers. I think Antonia Cornaro made a very strong plea for underground spaces, which kind of, for me, I have to say, a planner with 40 years experience, I always think of them as infrastructure, and that's not the place where people go very much unless it's a metro in London or Paris. But actually, she's really broadened my perspective and understanding, and obviously underground spaces have way bigger role than just being for the pipes and the tubes. They're actually, the people in some situations belong there, and we can use these spaces way more in terms of addressing climate change. So that was very informative. Thank you very much. I learned something today. From Lubaina Rangwala, I didn't know about that Mumbai had the climate action plan. It sounds like a really good one from her very brief presentation. It sounds really good. It seems to me it could be a model for not just the rest of India, but for the rest of the world. It talked about 6 priorities and 24 actions. And what I particularly appreciate in Lubaina's presentation is that the plan apparently is not just about physical interventions and projects. It is very much about actually the role of women and the role of different institutions and coordinating and organizing. So it has very strong organizational aspects. We have had in the history of planning so many good plans, which are good as a map or a project or a kind of description of what to do physically, but then they don't work because nobody thinks about the human aspect of it and organizational, institutional, and then things don't work. So, and this is, I would say this is actually, you know, feminine thinking in action. Things have to be connected, otherwise they will not work. Olusola Olufemi, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. Impossible to summarize. I learned two very interesting terms. The first one was feminization of poverty. I know very well what that means. Immediately, it is such a good expression to kind of explain what is happening worldwide, I guess, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, feminization, poverty. And then she talked about ethics of care, and she reminded us that climate crisis is a moral issue. In other words, climate crisis is a moral crisis, and a significant element of that moral crisis is actually inequality of the men and women, both again in the profession and in the field. At the end, she had another interesting expression, the connecting intelligence. I really like that. Yeah, that intelligence of connecting things. This is, I have to say, this is what women do better than men. So thank you very much for that, Olusola. And lastly, Urara Takaseki, she reminds us it's not all about planning. And I think we all need to be reminded every now and then, not all climate action is about planning. It has to do with local government and so many other things and so many channels of action. And she told us a very interesting story of the problem of education in Japan. And I know that one of the reasons that I am an academic by profession as well. I know that one of the reasons why we don't have enough women in planning is because we don't have them enough enrolled in the university planning programs and engineering and architecture and so on. So that's obviously part of the problem. And then what I found really interesting, that even when you kind of change the rules and you provide incentives and opportunities for women to participate more, in a situation like in Japan, they will still not be there. And we have like 7% of the professors are women and stuff like that. So the barriers are huge. They're often subtle. They happen even in countries which are actually wealthy and advanced, like Japan. It's not just in Africa or Latin America. So yeah, we know what the task is. It's not an easy one. The issues are very complex, but this is definitely a crucial matter. There will be no, I will conclude by saying there will be no effective climate action without a proper role for women.
Thank you, Duško. I think, yes, accelerated change, and we need accelerated action. Time is not on our side. Martina, you've got your hand raised.
Okay. Yes, I just want to excellent presentations by everyone, but I really think that the key issue we are acknowledging, and everybody in this forum is acknowledging, the moral crisis that Duško just mentioned. And of course, the discrimination of women in various ways, you know, from the absence from teaching from traditional patriarchal society, from being at the brunt ends of poverty and so on. You know, we had so many themes that highlighted this constant discrimination, which is not only in sub-Saharan Africa, it's happening in the UK. There is a strong movement now to recognizing that transport and streets are not safe for women, and the police is also unsafe for women in a country like the UK. So you know, we don't even want to think how it is in other countries where society is more patriarchal by culture. But with that background, we also have to recognize and address that the big theme here is the purpose of planning. You know, the purpose of planning, we've heard it in our conversation that ISOCAP chaired on Monday, that was focused on Middle Eastern countries, was all about planning infrastructure, planning growth, and similar to what Urara just said, economic, smart city, innovation, business, tech, etc. When the purpose of planning needs also to be that of bringing balance and justice. And that needs to be really very much at the forefront because it has been missing for too long. That's my remark.
Thank you, Martina. I think, yeah, perfectly summarized. Planning should focus on that balance. Olusola, I see you've also got your hand raised after we've heard the reply from Urara, but I'm very keen to hear your contribution as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the ethics of care.
Yes.
Where do we start? We could start from the classroom. We could start by changing our curriculum. I think when the issue of gender, coming from Africa, when you talk about gender, immediately everybody starts raising their eyes and rolling their eyes as if, oh, no, we don't want to talk gender. But we have to start talking gender. And the way we can do that, we have to make the men understand that gender is about equal opportunities. It's not a threat to them, but it's about equal opportunity, equal access to both genders. So the ethics of care will start right from the classroom, right from the curriculum change.
I think it's a very valid remark there. And Dushka, you also mentioned that how can planning education make the career choice more attractive for young women? So how do we as planners get that message to kids that's still at school that planning is a really good career? If somebody has an idea, I'm very interested, obviously, being in education myself. We're constantly trying to get that message across to students coming into university. But how can we as planners, what can we do to make it more attractive? Dushka, I know you asked the question, but if you want to contribute, yes.
Ioanni, you and I understand each other very well, of course, as academics. I would say that there are some positive signs that the advertising, I mean, you know, we live in the era of marketing and universities have to market their programs. And so there's a lot of advertising. And I've noticed recently that in planning has been, the planning programs have been advertising themselves as a more kind of a human-centered and people-centered profession. Previously, they used to be quite technical, and I would think that would kind of mostly appeal to boys and maybe not so much to girls. And I think it's kind of, planning is realizing that mistake. And after all, planning is indeed should be about people-centered. So I see some change in the advertising, in the promotion of planning programs, and there is some hope there, I think, that then more young women will enroll. I think we're moving in the right direction, but it's not just promotion. I think it's the image of the profession is somewhat kind of dry and bureaucratic, and I guess that's not appealing to either boys or girls.
Yes,
so we need
that's
to work on our image. I think that will be my conclusion.
Yes, and well, I see things like healthy cities and child-friendly spaces. Those things are really where women get involved. And maybe if we, in a way, can get our younger colleagues, students, to be more involved in that, it might help us to broaden our profession. It is that already, but it's just getting that message across of what we are really dealing with and how important it is to really tap into that social part of planning. Antonia, I saw you had your hand raised and then back, but do you want to contribute?
Yeah, just to add on to what Dushko just said, and also Aurora, I mean, I totally, and also Olusola, I really echo that. I think it starts early on in the education. It starts with really leading by example, and that's what I often hear. We're lacking role models, and we're lacking, or the young students say we're lacking role models on the one hand, and we're lacking practical applications. I mean, like, I think something like the ISOCARP Congress, what was done in Doha, where you really also explore off-site, real-life planning applications. You're not just sitting in a seminar room in a study hall and seeing slides, but you're really like out there. That really captures people, and that's what we do a lot also with our work. I mean, with the firm I work for, we often try to organize excursions, so actual site visits, actual being out there. What is the construction site? What is the planning process? And also the ETH, Federal Institute of Technology, where I work as a part-time lecturer, they had a session going on where several professors and lecturers, and they invited me as well to speak about actually the obstacles we had to overcome to get into the positions where we are now. Mm-hmm. And we had to be quite intimate in that sense, in terms of, it was not just show off, well, I'm this and I'm that, and I got, I have this position and that. It was more like, whoa, what were the fears? What were the doubts? What were the obstacles? So, and a lot of students commented that was extremely helpful to them to say, yeah, I can get there as well. Yes. So I think events like that.
Yeah, and I see the Generation Z students, so that's our current cohort of students coming in. They're the generation that really wants this experiential learning by doing. So I think, yeah, it's more and more important that we have that hands-on approach with our students, maybe even, bridging that academia industry gap, getting industry into our classes, getting students into practice. So maybe some innovative approaches to education. Lubaina, I see you've got your hand raised.
So just thinking about this idea of the ethics of care, and I feel it's so much more also about the process of planning. I think so much of planning is also very sort of solution oriented, and you have kind of an end goal, some sort of a tangible plan that you're going to be putting on the table, and also just between like planning education in India versus the US, for example, where I went to school. In India, it's very like spatial planning oriented. So, you're really like dealing with land use and infrastructure, and not so much sort of the, and I think it has changed a lot in the last, 10, 15 years, a lot of these new ways of thinking, as you say, resilience or healthy cities, child friendliness. These kinds of paradigms have really helped sort of make the profession more process oriented. But I think that's where it is, if as a practitioner, if the end, the aim is also to sort of develop a process that's more equitable, that's more sort of acknowledging of these softer aspects of care and the ethics of inclusion, diversity. I think the end result of the plan is definitely more reflexive of some of this.
Yes, very, very true. Thank you for that great input. And then one hand still up, Lindsay.
Hello.
Hi there. You're welcome.
Hi. I think I want to bounce off of what's kind of been said. I think in planning, so I'm coming from a American perspective. I came from undergrad, haven't gone to grad school yet, and I think kind of emphasizing that planning is more like it's got the hard skills, but then also the soft skills of like working with the community and the environment, with people with actual lives that the built environment impacts. I think that's one approach to possibly get more women in. And then in general, like I do remember that when I was first introduced, when I first heard about planning undergrad, I thought that was, I did think that it was very like civil engineering like. And yeah, I think I was personally interested in that, but that's not the case for everybody, for a lot of women. And so I think more of the approach of, because there is aspects of civil engineering, but there's also art, and you can pull in architecture. There's also economic development. You can come from a political background. You can come from a social work background, especially when you're working in like the health of the city. And so I think maybe going from the strategy of that this field is very what's the word, like, yeah, multidisciplinary. You can come from several different backgrounds and do something effective in planning, is one approach, rather than going, I think historically it's come from the approach of very like hard sciences. So maybe bringing in some of the softer skills and other multidisciplinary aspects of planning.
I can very much relate to what you say. I remember I thought, I'm not going to be a builder when somebody said to me, do city plan or urban planning. But I think so there's more awareness of the profession. It's, maybe now getting into that transdisciplinary take on planning. You know, we need different pathways into planning to really cover it all. I know we can go on this topic for very long, but at this point, I would like to hand over to Hope, that will also give us a reflection. So Hope, thank you very much, and your take on all that you've heard tonight, in the morning at your side, my night.
Oh, yeah. So it's around 22 past 11 in South Africa. Okay, thank you very much, colleagues. I've been sitting here, I'm thinking how best to summarize this. And I think we had a lot of interesting information from different speakers. And I think Dushko already did some great work in trying to summarize that. So I'm not going to try to summarize each and every person who presented the presentation, but I just want to note some few things. More like my takeaway message here. What come up very strong is that actually there are two powerful phenomena going on across the globe. And the one of it is as a rise of women, and the other one is the rise of global warming. And these two phenomena are interlinked and are related. And as a result of that, this is overlooked. Sometimes people, they actually do not see the relationship between the two. And the relationship between the two, between women, girls, and the warming world actually is not life, but it's actual death. And this has come out very strongly throughout the presentation. And when we even talk about the code of conduct as a planner and how, our ethics basically. And the research will tell you that women, of course, I think one of the speakers did talk about the impact of the climate change and the displacement which happened during the time of global warming. And also the issue around the disaster. When we have disaster, women, they tend to be the one who are hit the hardest. And they have to find a place to live in, and that becomes the problem. And also they get to be injured. There are statistics which suggest that women, they tend to be the ones who are injured most on all those natural disasters that we're talking about. And if we were to go and try to address the issue of global warming or climate change as such, we have to look closely around the issue of empowering women. So if we are actually able to gain grounds on gender equality, we are most likely going to be able to address some of these issues. It is estimated that about 60 to 80% of women across Southern Africa are actually the farmers, and yet they produce about close to 80% of food compared to their male counterpart on just 5 hectare land. But now what happened is that you find that yet they're limited. the same in terms of the land rights that they have with that particular piece of land. They're also limited in terms of the credit. And you all we know that if we have more, we depend more on farming, and I'm talking about a meaningful way, and which is take cognizance of climate, we will address issues to do with the deforestation and going forward. So just to say, if we are really to address the issues of global warming, climate change, the crisis that we have, we really need to look closely on how do we empower women, also deal with the issue of gender equality. I think those will be my just closing remarks as I'm expected to do that. Thank you very much, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hope. I think that is a spot on summary. Sidushko also give you a hand there. So thank you for bringing that message. And as final word, Elizabeth, I would like to hand over to you, our ISOCARP champion of women in planning, for bringing this event together and really championing, you know, just getting the conversation going, enabling our planners, our colleagues to move this very important topic forward. So Elizabeth, if you want to have the last word, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Well, it was a very rich discussion and inspiring stories, and also new facts and trends actually that we heard about. There's a lot of different things we can work on. I think this exactly 1 year ago, we had the first Cyber Agora on women in planning. It has been the first time featuring events at the World Planning Congress, and we will continue this. One of them, Antonia, was, for instance, the sharing of stories. And we realized with people who were there, it's extremely important to listen at journeys that women go through to end up in positions where they are or not. And that's indeed very, a lot of integrity and openness to discuss this. We will certainly continue this because we've seen it's important, and in person it works very well. We will amplify voices, but and I also think that the whole Women in Planning organical group that has been created can be strengthened, and momentum is growing, so this can go more into a moment in a movement. We will be reaching out also for people that are interested, so we can make a more structured group or committee with some specific actions. I also see, I saw the last weeks that there is some funds being raised and foundations that are focusing more on gender. Again, we will need time and action from our members too, to help, for instance, with mobilizing this, so we can offer activities in this field. Yes, and I think we're also looking at simply all the activities that we do. World Planning Congress, can we ensure balance of gender and also diversity, and especially underrepresented countries in sharing events. I think it's extremely important to have more diversity and women also in the board. And to do this, it would be also very important to know why, what would be important to enable this. There can be many ways. It can be the way that the elections go, etc. So it would be very important to get from you also insights and inputs on this. So yes, we can, half an hour longer, and there's still a lot to say. So this will be continued. Thank you very much for all the panel speakers, our reflectors, and my co-moderators to join, and a lot of thanks to the audience to join. We had people registered, but unfortunately also from parts of the world where it is really in the middle of the night, from more than 30 countries. We had half of them, there was more than 80 people registered working in the Global South, just to give you an idea, and we had half of them younger than 35. So that is also very promising. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you in the World Urban Forum and also in the World Planning Congress in October in Brussels. Thank you so much.